Okay, hi everybody, Jay Baba. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate this opportunity. I want to say something very brief, is that I don't know to what extent people might be wondering where am I going? Is this really going to be worth the trip, the little journey? But it will be, and the things that as we're going through the history of philosophy of perception and philosophy of mind, there are certain concepts that are getting introduced that are all going to be necessary at the back when we get to the conclusion, further on. And so all this is necessary. I wouldn't do it. I'm leaving out a lot. I'm leaving out stuff that was in my book, and I'm even considering taking it out of my book. I'm learning what's really essential. So, last week, before we start, I mentioned this last week and decided not to. I want to introduce one unusual word that we don't usually use in our everyday vocabulary, and it's hypostasis, okay? And hypostasis has a certain meaning in the Catholic Church, which has to do with the three people of the Trinity, three persons of the Trinity, but that's not what we mean by it here. It has a more fundamental meaning, and I'm using it in its natural sense, and that's a broader sense. And that means to treat something that's not a thing like it is a thing. So most often that's done to something like to an abstract idea. So an example is evil. We all know how easy it is for people to treat evil like it's a stuff, or it's a force. And Baba says right in the discourses, it's not a force by itself, okay? In itself, it's sort of it's what we describe very ignorant action, I guess, or there's other ways to describe evil, but it's not a stuff. And I've actually heard people say, oh no, I have felt evil. It is a palpable thing. So you've heard that. So that's hypostatizing something that's an abstract idea. Now sometimes we also hypostasize, but they're both different spellings of the same word. Sometimes we hypostasize or hypostatize a made-up thing. Okay, so an example would be, some parents sincerely teach their children that Santa is coming down the chimney. So their children, in believing that, and the cookie and all, they are hypostatizing a fabricated thing. Got it? So it could be a made-up thing, or it could be an abstract idea, but you're making what's not a thing like it's a physical, tangible thing. Okay? And the reason I bring this up is because it's a theme that will be a word that's important throughout the series as we go on. Not a little today, more and more as we go on. It's a theme. All right. Now, summarizing last week, very briefly, I made the mistake of summarizing too much last week. It was a big mistake, I learned. Last week we talked first about the ancient heart. They means in the time of the Odyssey and the Iliad and the writing of the Old Testament, they believed that the heart was a physical thing in their chest, in their body. Okay? And, okay, got that. And that is where the higher emotions like courage and battle lay and resided. Okay? And when people began to think more rationally around, the year 600 BC in what's today Western Turkey, and was part of the Greek colonies around the Mediterranean at that time. The first, what are called pre-Socratic philosophers that came before Socrates, who some regard as the real first philosopher, but these people are called pre-Socratic philosophers. Aristotle later said they were studiers of nature. They looked around at nature and they didn't believe in the old gods. They were agnostic, kind of like today, early version of scientists. And they wanted to find natural causes. And the way they did that is they looked around in nature and then they used things that they found in nature And then they hypothesized an unseen something like that by analogy, and then they basically hypostatized it. Got that? Got it. Oh, right. Oh, thank you, Chris. Chris is all right. They go if they read. I have to say, stop saying got it. It's a very bad habit. So now, strangely, when people write about these ancient people and their thinking, they often warn the reader to understand that we can't really fully understand how they thought. There's many interpretations. We do the best we can to sort of reconstitute it. You got that? So one of the strange things that they did is that to find the primal substance of the world, that the world is made of, they looked for inspiration in their own breath, which they saw as the life essence. Now, when you breathe, you know the four elements of Greek science was air, water, fire, and earth. Well, if you breathe on your hand, you get air, obviously, and when you get dampness, which is water, and you get a warmth, which insinuates a burning inner fire. Okay, so the first philosopher speculated that everything is made of water. This is how he was thinking. Okay, because that must be what's motivating everything, because it's in the breath, etc. And then the next one said it was air. Okay, and then another said it was fire. You got it? Okay. I said you got it. All right. Okay. Now, those were the pre-Socratics. They were called the Meletians or the Ionians, and they lived over here in western today's Turkey. That's Miletus right there, Miletus. And okay, so, and one of these Meletian philosophers that thought that way, thank you, I really appreciate that. One of these, his name is Anaxagoras, and he was a typical guy. He believed that everything was made of all four elements. All four elements are primal, and then they come together in certain ways and makes the world somehow. Okay, well, trying to build. Okay, so he explained everything in terms of that, and then he. They don't know exactly why he came over to Athens, okay, when Socrates was about 20 years old. And he brought philosophy to Athens. Now, Athens was becoming the cultural center of the Greek world. But you have to understand something about the people of Athens. They were different than the other people. They were very religious, because it was the place of the temple of Zeus, and they were very orthodox about their religious beliefs, okay? And the myths, the Homeric myths were like the gospel. And these guys like Anaxagoras got very unpopular because very much like Galileo threatened the Catholic Church much later, the same thing happened with him. And he was accused of impiety, and he fled finally into exile. Back to up here before he died. Socrates saw that, and if you know that Socrates drank hemlock when he was accused of impiety, he drank the hemlock partly because that had been one of his teachers, and he didn't want the same thing. He didn't want to be like his teacher. He didn't want to run away. Okay? Now, hopefully I didn't skip a slide. Did I skip a slide? No. So now we're going to discuss just these three philosophers in terms of their explanation of perception. Because perception is a theme through this whole thing, and it's going to be very important when we get to the punchline toward the last talks. And they're called the Athenians, and so the first was Socrates. Socrates, when he became famous, was about 70 years old, and he would walk through the streets of Athens, and flocks of of usually young boys and his disciples, and would follow him along. They'd often bring a politician over to talk to him. It was kind of, those were exciting times. Plato was his best student. After Socrates died, Plato wrote. Socrates never wrote anything. Plato wrote the dialogues, and Socrates was always the protagonist, the main protagonist in the stories, or most of them. They're the dialogues of Plato. Then Plato opened an academy, or I'm not sure when, and then at 18 years old, another philosopher came to study at the academy named Aristotle. So each was the teacher of the other. And then Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, who apparently did not understand philosophy very well. So I mentioned Anaxagoras. He came over, and to Athens, he was the first philosopher to kind of arrive and get famous. And these were the kinds of ideas he had. Like the idea was like there's some air and it's under the earth, and the earth is flat. It's kind of like a tabletop. And then if you have fluctuations of the air, of the cushion of air, that causes earthquakes. But he had some good ideas too. He thought the moon was a rock and reflected the sun. Okay, so we don't. So that kind of very scientific kind of thinking, very conjectural. Okay. And always in terms of the four elements, okay? Everything always made sense in terms of the four elements. Now Socrates, they don't even know if Socrates really met Anaxagoras, but he did, apparently one of his teachers was a student of Anaxagoras, and he had been asked to read the writings of Anaxagoras. So we're going to get to a quote by Socrates. Socrates eventually grew weary of his teacher's strictly physical and speculative explanations, feeling that such ideas did not touch on what he believed were deeper issues being overlooked, mainly how we know what we do, okay? So where these Milesians were looking at the world from the outside, at the world, and making theories, he was interested in, well, how are we making these theories? Or how got that? He's interested in the mind. He's the first one to take that interest that we know of. Now this quote, I'm going to read the whole quote. I eliminated it a little bit to make it shorter. It's sort of moving to me. Socrates, as an older man, from one of the dialogues of Plato. So this is attributed pretty closely to the real Socrates. I was glad to think that I had found in Anaxagoras a teacher about the cause of things after my own heart, and that he would tell me first whether the earth is flat and round, and then would explain why it is so of necessity, saying which is better, and that it was better to be so. I never thought that Anaxagoras would bring in any other cause for them than that it was better for them to be as they are. This you'll find is a common way of thinking then, okay? Things are the way they ought to be. Not because of God, okay? That you'll see. This wonderful hope was dashed as I went on reading and saw that the man made no use of mind, nor gave it any responsibility for the management of things, but mentioned as causes air and ether and water and many other strange things. Okay? So that's the turning point and of Socrates as a young man growing frustrated with the past. Now, he developed a method, and we've all heard of it, called the Socratic method, and what that was they would bring people to talk to him, or they would run into people in the street, him and his disciples, and they'd be standing around very rapt. Because he had been trained not in philosophy, he had been trained in rhetoric, by a rhetor, okay? How to speak well and properly. But his method was, he would ask a question, the person would answer the question, and then he would show why that didn't really work. But he would explore it to find, and then he would rephrase the question. And by doing this, they would go deeper and deeper into the thing. And we'll give you an example in a minute. So this is one. Now, before we go into this, Socrates is the first person to recognize, as far as I know, to recognize abstract ideas. I said in an earlier talk what an abstract idea is, but we're going to get it again, okay? Let's say I say, Rich was so courageous last night. He did a courageous thing. Boy, did he show a lot of courage. Well, that's a particular act, and I'm making a judgment about that act. But it's a different subject to talk about what is courage, okay? What are you even talking about when you say he did a courageous act? Maybe it was a foolish act, okay? So we have to really, you got that? So, no, sorry. Boy, do I do that a lot. So, I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to read what's on the page, because I think I can explain it faster. This is a typical conversation with Socrates. Socrates will ask a question like, what is courage? Okay? And the person will give examples. They go like, like stabbing your opponent in war, like, and he give like two more, like, you're sick and you're dying, or something like that. And he would give examples, as if that was what Socrates is asking. And Socrates would be humorous, and he would say, Socrates would be humorous, and he would go, well, you are so brilliant. I asked you for one thing, and you gave me three. But he's being sarcastic. Because let me rephrase the question. Got it? I don't want the examples of courage. I want you to tell me what courage is. So it was very hard for them. So everybody was walking around using concepts, okay? But they had never taken a look at them, okay? Now that relates quite closely to what I said about his frustration with Anaxagoras and wanting to look about how do we know what's going on in the self, in the mind, okay? Or the soul, which they equated at that time. How we know what we do. People have been used to looking outward and making judgments like that is, okay, I already said all that. Already said that. Socrates was opening the minds of Athenians to the consideration of their abstract. Okay, I said that. Now, there's a second thing that Socrates is known for. Okay, Socrates believed that all knowledge was contained in everybody. Okay, and the teacher didn't really teach him anything. What all the teacher did was have him access it within himself. So the story of Meno, it's a dialogue called Meno. Meno was a man who was an Athenian aristocrat, and he had a slave. And him and a buddy went to talk about a problem with Socrates, and it doesn't matter what that was. Socrates wanted to demonstrate something to them. And he said, have the slave, I want to speak to the slave. I don't think the slave has a name. I think it's a slave boy, okay? And he then begins to talk to the slave boy, and he says, I think he might be drawing in the sand, okay? And he says, here's a problem in geometry. But these guys really studied geometry, okay? Just believe me. That's what intellectuals did. They studied geometry. And he lays out the problem, and the boy, the slave, who has no education, he answers it, okay? It's intuitive, okay? And so that was the proof of his theory, okay? Now, Socrates died, and I just put that slide because I love it. So he drank the hemlock, as I already said. And then after the death of Socrates, Plato, who's the second of our three philosophers, he began to write. And he was not interested, much like his teacher, of course, Socrates. Plato was not interested in what the world was made of. He kind of left that to other people. He had an academy, okay? He opened an academy after Socrates died. After Socrates died, he was very upset. He traveled the world for a little while. And then, like going to Egypt and stuff. And then he came back and he established Plato's Academy. And there, he was the chief whatever. And, but Aristotle would eventually, as a young man, come to study and eventually teach there. But his interest was but rather how we gain our knowledge of abstract ideas. Okay? How do we have these ideas? How do we know what we mean when we say courage or beauty? We all talk about beautiful things, and we're all, oh, yes, it's so beautiful. But some disagree, you know. But then, how do we know what beauty is? How come we were able to recognize what's beautiful? That is a really deep. These are continual questions. They never go away. Now, his most developed theory and most famous is called the theory of forms, which could also be called the theory of ideas, and I'm going to explain it. Okay, so we have here a cup, okay? Now, I know it's a cup. I'm not sure, okay, how do I know it's, okay, so I could go in the other room, and there could be a bunch of cups all lined up, or there might be some over there, and they all look different. They're all different shapes. Some of them could be quite unique, okay? But I would still call them cups. So those are particular cups, okay? Those are objects. But what about the cupness? How do I have my idea of what cupness is? How come well, no matter how strange these cups are, I know when it's a cup, and I know when it's a thing that looks kind of like a cup, okay? But it's not a cup. So he's going, where's this cupness? Now, this is a kind of crude example. He applies this to all the deeper things like courage and love and beauty, okay? But he believed that there was a world of forms that was in some way metaphysical. You couldn't see it. It's sort of a predecessor of heaven, okay? And in this heaven, there was the perfect cup. Now and there was the perfect horse, and there was the perfect man, and there was the perfect everything, okay? Every utensil, everything that was in the world. There was a perfect one in the world of forms. And beauty itself was in the world of forms. And this is now somehow he believed that we could recall, you know, I screwed up because of the way I took my slides. I'm learning, okay? I gotta back up a little. Before his theory of forms, I'll just briefly, his first idea before he had the theory of forms was that the reason we were recognizing cups was because we had seen cups in a previous incarnation, okay? Previous lifetime. But when he thought about that more, there's a dialogue where he explores that possibility, because it was common among the Pythagoras taught reincarnation, who he was very influenced by. But he thought, well then, that doesn't solve the problem, because how did I find out what cups were in my last life? It's just pushing the problem back. Got that? So that's what I should have said. I went a little out of order. So this is why he came up with his theory of forms, okay? So, but he still believed that it was recollection. So he came up with the idea that there was this world of forms, and we had once been there. And we had a glimpse. It was like where the gods were. And we had a glimpse of that world. I want to just interrupt here. Well, I'll finish. We had a glimpse before we had a fall. Okay? And that's where the Christians have the great fall, which they put Plato's idea of the fall from the world of forms together with the Garden of Eden, and you get the sort of the same concept of a fall from a perfect paradisal place, okay? Now, going back a second. Imagining an abstract idea of a cup as a cup someplace is a perfect example of hypostatic thinking, of a hypostasis, okay? That's all I want to say. That's a problem, all right? I mean, this is essentially, Plato is extremely important, but that is a serious problem in Plato. And Plato himself, before he died, saw problems with his theory of forms. And I won't go into it. It's called, I won't go into it. Now, Finally, his best, most famous expression of the theory of forms is called the cave, the analogy of the cave. And I just want to show it because it's, well, just interesting. This is where it gets fun and interesting. Okay. The analogy of the cave, which I think it's in the Republic, is meant to explain the relation between our experience and the world of forms, which are somewhere else, okay? So he described this story like a myth. He taught, his ideas were very mystical and far-reaching, and he taught them using myths and analogies. Like the fall is a myth that Plato literally made up. He was writing myths, okay? That's how he taught, with myth and allegory. Okay, so this one is an allegory. So, in this diagram, and most people are familiar with it, and I understand that, but there might be somebody who's not, and it's always fun. So, in this, Plato had been a slave at one point in his life, and he had actually been chained up, and then finally somebody recognized his intelligence and bought his freedom. He had been a slave, so it's interesting because this analogy gives the analogy of slaves. And the slaves, there's this cave. That's the outside of the cave. You go down into the cave, okay? And down the bottom of this cave, quite cruelly, there are these prisoners, and they're all bound, and their heads are bound, and they can only face the back wall of the cave. And behind them, but they don't know it, there's a fire on a raised platform. And then these people, well, I don't know what they represent, actually, to tell you the truth. They carry these little statues, a little puppet show. And they're always parading over there. And so the slaves who are bound toward the back wall of the cave, the deepest interior of the cave, they only see the shadows. And they were bound from birth, which is strange, but it's a metaphor, it's an analogy. So they've been there since birth, so they've never seen any other world. So they take the world of shadows to be the real world. Then we'll find out what happened. One of the slaves gets freed, goes out, and discovers, he sees this, he sees what these really were all the time, has a hard time because he's never seen the light before, he's been in the dark. It's very, very confusing for him. And then he goes out and he sees the sun, okay? Which is reality, okay? There's layers of reality here. It's very interesting. Plato saw levels of knowledge. He didn't go, it's true, it's false. He had levels of knowledge. So this was the lowest level of knowledge. And that's perception, with our eyes and our ears and our fingers, okay? That's what he called this, and he called it doxa. No, well, it's a form of doxa. It means, I don't want to get too complicated. But I want to show a little movie that demonstrates Plato's cave analogy, because it's only 3 minutes, and it's quite enjoyable, and maybe this, hopefully, people who haven't seen it, there. Here's the movie. And we have the speaker set up so we hear it.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that a prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
Now, this introduces to philosophy the idea of a second world, okay? A hypostatic world. It's sort of a it's ideas, but it's reified into things. But it's an external real world. Oh, so that divides the universe into an external real world. As you see, it's outside the cave, external, and inward, internal world of mental representations of it, okay? That we experience with our senses. Reality is where we cannot directly perceive it by sense. Now, that idea never, ever went away, okay? All philosophers since Plato have been representationalists. Essentially, I don't know any of the art. The only alternative is called naive realism. The idea that you just, I don't know, you don't have any philosophy at all. You just think that there's a little man inside your head and he's looking through a window. It doesn't matter. Anyway, I've talked about this a lot. That's called the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem, of course, is the problem that there's a world outside of our head. Their brain is in there, but nothing from the world gets inside their brain. So it can't be the real world that's in our brain. The chair's not in our head. I say that and people get insulted. My daughter got insulted. I said, no, I want you to notice that the chair's not in your head. So it's got to be a representation of your experience. Okay. And as I said, you close your ears, you close your eyes, and you see, when you do that and you block your head, you can't see anything. Obviously, okay? That sounds silly too, but it's not silly. Okay. Alfred North Whitehead was a 20th century philosopher, and he kind of summed it up, and he said that all philosophy is footnotes on Plato. And really, you could almost say that all philosophy is footnotes on the cave analogy, okay? You can see the implications toward mysticism, but it has implications in science. It's actually similar to as we'll see when we get to the Renaissance, we still have something like the cave, okay? Now, a lot of people that don't know this because they just didn't know. They actually are walking around naive realists. Like, for instance, let me say, the normal person, you say, what is matter? And they go, well, like that, something I'm looking at, or, you know, that I can touch, you know? But that's actually, in philosophy, that's wrong. And it's not controversial. It's not like there's some philosophers that would agree, they would go, no, all of them would agree that you're wrong. Matter is a theoretical entity. Okay? That there is a world is a theory. We infer from our experience that there is a world. Nobody ever saw it directly. And that's even if you're a materialist. And this is hard to digest, and it's okay, but there's a video, and I'm going to be saying it more than once so it'll become clear. Now, I want to say just briefly a little about, I haven't talked about how Plato taught at his academy sense perception. How do you sense things with your eyes and your ears? Like how are you in contact with the world through them? Now, this is actually a different subject. This is more the physiology of perception. Like today we have brains and electricity and optic nerve, and then they didn't, okay? But they needed something. That sounds strange, but I'm going to tell you what it is, and it's going to kind of blow your mind. Sometimes when you talk to people, and you say, there is a feeling, just like it feels when you look at the world like you're inside your head looking through a glassless window. That's how it feels, if you were honest. But it's not that way, but it feels like it should be. Similarly, a lot of people have a feeling that their eyes, something's coming out of their eyes and it's hitting on something, okay? And I've always noticed that that was exactly what they do with Superman's heat vision and his X-ray vision. It's always shooting out of his eyes, okay? That was actually the similar to the view of the ancient world, including what Plato taught. Now, Plato didn't come up with these theories. These came from an earlier philosopher who was a Pythagorean, and it was the best they had at the time, and he had this taught in his academy. So in other words, it was like, it's not my area is about knowledge, and but you want to get into physiology or perception, this guy's the best we have in the world at the time. Here's my pens. Okay, so essentially, like merges with like, or like likes like. So you have various elements. You remember earth, air, fire, and water. And something like these elements comes out of little pores and out of your ears, out of your eyes, out of your nose. And it goes out and it touches on something coming the other way, which is made of the same stuff. Okay, so you've got something out here, it's a baseball, okay? And you look in here, and something's radiating from it, maybe particles, and then this stuff comes out of here, and then they blend, and it's very bizarre. And I'm not going to really say much more about it than that, but I'm going just to show you how strange things got after Plato. It's sort of like a certain kind of fire came out of the eyes, and a certain kind of air came out of the ears, or something like this. It's so strange that I don't want to spend time on it. But after Greece, there was Rome. And in Rome, they had philosophers that were responding to people like Aristotle and Plato. And they had various other names. This is later. This is in the 2nd century and stuff. And one of them, they were called the Stoics. And they had a very funny idea of perception. And I think it's worth stating because it's sort of weirdly like, yeah, that kind of feels like that. I can sort of see how they could have thought that. So here's your body, okay, and your ears and your eyes and your nostrils. And they believed, since Aristotle, who we haven't discussed yet, that there was 5 senses, okay, just like we have. But there was a 6th sense, but it wasn't like a psychic sense. It was literally an organ. And it was inside the body, and it was called the common sense. And everything got to the common sense, and that's where it got incorporated as one thing. Because you could look at something and hear it at the same time, and that had to be somewhere they all had to get to the same organ. So they had a Now, the Stoics believed they were materialists, okay? They were materialists. They thought of everything in terms of physical stuff. Okay, so they were not Platonic at all. But they still had this idea that you got the common sense, and it's like an octopus, okay? And it goes out through all the organs, right, now through the ears, see? And it does that. And it touches on the stuff, and it kind of taps, like a blind man, they say, taps on things with a cane. And so he can kind of see with his cane, okay, because he's sort of picking up and they said there was sort of like there were vibrations that like along a rubber band, that somehow this could feel the vibrations of the rubber band. And this was made out of like psych, okay? It's a very materialistic idea of the mind and perception. But it's about the strangest, well, it gets stranger in the 20th century. All right, that's enough of that. Now we got to get to Aristotle. Because there's one more philosopher. And it's real important, and I really want to finish this. Okay. Because it only makes sense if we can get to the last slide. Okay, that's good enough. And that was called an effluence. An effluence is something coming out, okay? When you imagine something coming in to your head, that's called influx. These are two ways of looking at perception. Very strange. Okay, Aristotle, as I said, he was he was the son of a physician, a very educated boy. At 18 years, he lived in Macedonia, which is above Greece. It wasn't really part of, it wasn't, anyway, it was far above sort of Turkey, Greece. Well, you know, it's where Alexander the Great comes from, Macedonia. So so Aristotle, he comes as a student, and he learns this theory of forms, which you have to learn when you get there. And he also learned about all these people I've been talking about, even last time. He learns them all. He's actually who we have knowledge of those pre-Socratics from. He wrote a book called On the Soul. And then he gave all these ideas I've been telling you. It all really originates. That's the source. On the Soul by Aristotle, which he wrote while at the academy, I guess. Now, what Aristotle did not like about those theories was their reliance on conjectures about unseen substances and particles, like hypostases. Okay? Or in Plato's case, an unseen world of forms. He wanted to be empirical, and that means be really purely based at things on observation, rely on observation. He felt they were too far out. Okay. So he wanted to be down to earth. Now this painting is by Raphael, and it's a detail from a painting called the Athenians by Raphael, and it's a big painting. You've probably seen it before, and it's meaningful how it's done. You notice this is Plato as an old man at the academy, and this is the young Aristotle who came to teach at the academy. He came as a student, but eventually he taught. And Plato is pointing up for the transcendental, and Aristotle sort of reprimanding his teacher. You know, the earth, let's be down to earth. Got that? That's the deliberate meaning of that, those gestures in that painting. The world has forever since had a kind of a duality between two ways of thinking, sort of looking at the world from the outside, like Aristotle, and looking at it from the within, and self-examining, and mystical, which is toward Plato. And these are both necessary. It's not like one's wrong, one's right. But today we lean toward Aristotle because we're a materialistic society. But at other times, like the early Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages up to about 1200, we were toward Plato. It was a very mystical time. Probably there was a feeling to the early Middle Ages that we have forgotten and don't appreciate that was very spiritual. We make fun of them because they weren't very materialistic, but they probably had an inner feeling. For Aristotle, okay, so we're going to cover how Aristotle destroys everything that Plato said. He wants to get rid of all this woo-woo, okay? So, first of all, remember the forms. How do you know what cupness is? You have these individual cups. And so I have to first say, he was a taxonomist. And a taxonomist is a person who breaks, has a bunch of butterflies, and he goes, this is this kind of butterfly, this is this kind of butterfly. He's very interested in the world in that kind of way. Like I said, from the outside of things, looking upon them, and breaking them into categories. Anyway, Aristotle did not believe that the reason we recognize a cup from a plate, so it's a little like taxonomy. How do we break it into, we could have a taxonomy of kitchen utensils. We have cups and plates and pots and pans, and Aristotle would do things like that. So it's kind of obsessed. It's kind of funny. So he said that no matter how any particular cup was shaped, what all cups had in common was their function. Okay? So a cup is this, and that function is the essence of what it means to be a cup. Okay? And that's why we recognize them as cups, because we see their function. We recognize their intended purpose. And the function, in turn, dictates the shape. So the function of a cup, of course, is to hold water so we can drink it. And so we shape it this way with our hand and all this. Oh, this is what he felt. That's what the form was, the function and the shape, both. Because the form followed the function, but that's what we mean by a cup. We mean something for drinking. Very down to earth. There's no mysterious world of forms. Okay? So now, Aristotle on the soul. We've got to get rid of a mysterious soul too. So he said the essence or form of a thing was its function or purpose. The essence of what a thing is, as I just said. That's its form. The form of a cup was its function of holding liquid. As for living things, when we say they have a soul, we mean they're alive. And so we need to be able to just point to the functions that we mean by something being alive. So he, being a taxonomist, he broke things down into 3 kinds of living things, main categories. The main categories were plants, animals, and people. And he said, now, animals, plants, their functions are they can receive nutrition and they can reproduce. And then animals, they can do those, and they can perceive, and they can move. They have those, okay? And then humans, they even have reason on top of all those. And so that's what we mean by the soul. Okay? Your soul is the fact that you can fornicate and have babies, and that you can eat food. And those are your functions, and that's the essence of what it is to be alive. So that's what we mean by your soul. And I'm not going to say to develop that, because I'm learning not to do that. So now, to understand where we're going to go, because Aristotle gets really strange. It took me, some philosopher will probably say I got it wrong. It's so hard to understand this stuff, you have no idea. So it's pain. But Aristotle has a vision of the world as purpose ordered according to purpose. Everything has a purpose. Everything is in its place. That's how nature is. They were living in a more natural world at that time. They didn't have all the strange televisions and things where it's not always sure what the purpose is. You know, there were rocks and there were trees and there were plants and there were oxes and cows, and that's what he was looking at mostly, and people. And so by the way, I will say this, that he did taxonomy. He broke everything down, as I said before. He broke down plants and animals, all the different kinds, and then their anatomy, and he had all the parts of the anatomy, and he broke that down. He broke down their diet, habitats, drama. You've heard of Aristotelian drama. He's the one who found the parts of an Aristotelian play. I mean, they were just making plays intuitively, but he's the one who like dissected it. And he even had how animals copulate. Well, meaning, you know, how do butterflies have sex? So he was that's how he thought. But he believed everything was ordered, and Aristotle had this notion of a rationally ordered universe. But notice his obsession with taxonomy. What is a taxonomist obsessed with? Order. Everything has to be ordered in a rational way. A, B, this is number 5. This is why I got these butterflies. I got A, B, okay? So there's a very good chance that Aristotle is projecting his own love of taxonomy onto the universe. His own love of order. His own incredibly massive left brain mind, okay, that has everything in categories. He's projecting it. He's not really seeing it there. That's what I suspect. And I'll actually show it eventually that there's tremendous evidence of that. Aristotle's notion of things ordered by purpose. Now, you have to know that to understand his theory of perception, because Aristotle, doesn't matter, you can read it, to show how perception, okay, now Aristotle disagreed with Plato. Plato believed, as I said, that we don't see the real world as it is. Our perceptions are a shadow of something that we can't even imagine. That's what he thought. But not Aristotle. He felt it had to be on the outside, same as the inside. So if you see red, there's got to be some red outside you. Okay, if you see a frog, there's a frog. And it looks like there's a frog in front of you, then there's a frog in front of you, because that's how it looks. That you're getting what's called veridical representation. It's the exact copy. So, what was his argument for that? It's because the world is ordered that way. He said that there are two kinds of power: passive and active. Now, this is really strange. Now, everything is ordered in terms of these two kinds of power. And I'm going to demonstrate what he means. And I'm going to show he saw it in everything. He saw it in how babies are made. He saw it in fire. He saw it, and I'll explain that. This is hard to understand, let alone explain. But I will be able to do it because I bought some Play-Doh. So an example of these two types of power. My finger has an active power, according to Aristotle. I can poke things because I have active power in my finger, okay? Now, I'm going to go do something. I got an active finger here. It has active power. This has a passive power, okay? Now, okay. Now, I couldn't have done that if this didn't have the power to be acted upon by my finger. Okay? Because this doesn't have the power to be acted upon by my finger. This doesn't have that passive power that this blade does. Okay, so you got that. Now, that active power is always there, but it has to be activated or actualized, its power, by my finger, which always has its power. It just actualized the power of the Play-Doh to be acted upon. Okay? I said that right. And so, it's odd, I know. I finally get it. But I'm going to just give you some examples of how he applied this to life. So, a man and a woman, they can have a baby. The man, he's active. The woman, she's passive. Okay? Very male chauvinistic idea. Well, Aristotle thought that women were imperfect men, so he was a male chauvinist. So, what happens when they have sex is that the sperm, which is active because it's got all that heat and all this stuff, it's active. And it goes into the woman who's totally passive, goes in her body, and then, like a carpenter, it goes to work building a person out of the raw material in her body. That's just laying there, passively waiting to get built by the little carpenters. Well, I don't think he thought it was several sperms. I think he just, let's get going, let's build a person. That's what he thought. Now, another one is, today we know that's not true. Today we know that the sperm does very little in reproduction, and that the organs of the woman's body are much more active in producing the baby. Okay? This is the opposite of what he thought. Another one is combustion. He thought that you light a piece of wood, the wood is passive. The fire is active. So the only way you could have a fire for the wood is if you touched it with something on fire. Okay? But today we know about spontaneous combustion. You can throw a bunch of creosote, soaked rags in it and put a lid on it, and they're going to make the burnable thing is going to make the fire. And actually, more of combustion has to do with chemical processes that are going on in the wood than they are in the fire. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. The fire is the result of the chemical processes in the wood. So Aristotle could not have been more wrong. Okay? And then the digestion. His belief was that the body was completely passive in gaining nutrition. And the food did all the work of getting you nutrition. Today, of course, we know that's not true. Got it? Okay. Now, this is how he got to prove, because it was so obvious the world is this way, because he was projecting it, that this would prove that our experience was vertical. There's no skeptical problem about the outside world, like Plato had. Because the world was so wonderfully ordered as such, perception had a passive power. This is an I, okay? And this is a thing out there, okay? It's got the active power. That's a baseball. It's got the active power. Or if there's some something, I'll tell you what he thinks is getting to the eye in a second. This is passive. This is active. They were made for each other. Oh, I forgot to tell you. All things are they're not designed by God. It's just that the world is rational. Got the difference? It just happens to be the fact that the world is rationally ordered. It's not because somebody's thinking it rationally. That's just rationally ordered world. It was quite obvious to rational people that it was rationally ordered, which we'll see further on in Renaissance. It's not. The world's really, we'll see some things that he thought they're going to fall apart. He believed that this was designed, and all these things come in pairs. So you have the sperm and the woman, they're kind of invented with each other in mind, okay? And the food and the stomach, they're invented with each other in mind. See, they have to be together because the food activates the passive power, and actually the passive power activates the active power. They have to come in pairs. So things that you see, objects that you see, were invented, the eye was invented with the objects that it sees in mind, specifically to get true beliefs from them. So therefore, whatever you're thinking in here has to be true. Has to be true. Has to be true. Because the world wouldn't make any sense any other way. That's enough. There's a little more detail on it, but if they're visible in the slides, and I'm going to move on because we're going to get to the end. Okay. Notice what Aristotle is avoiding. He's ignoring the question of how. Well, let's skip that. Okay. Aristotle's projection, I think I've already explained that. I think I've already explained this. Oh, just so you know, the analogy that Plato gave for, oh no, I do need to explain this. The analogy that Plato gave for perception was a stamp and wax, okay? Now, the object leaves the form, the shape, somehow on the eye, the ear, the nose, okay? But in a weirder sense. He believed that what was coming from this, obviously the ball doesn't get through your eyeball, okay? Anybody could tell that. He actually did strange things like touch his eye to see if it would cause him to see, and he found that he couldn't see his eye if he touched it. So they were really quite right there on the edge. He believed that remember I told you about the form? It's the function and the shape of what it is, the essence. That's called the form. And the stuff that the ball is made of, that's the matter. So the physical material it's made of, like hay and leather. Well, the hay and leather, the matter doesn't go through the eye, but the form does. So what penetrates through the mind, through the eye to the mind, is the form but not the matter. And this just made so much sense. And now I said earlier, I think last week, that the reason that I said that the skeptical problem has always been with us. This shows the skeptical problem. The skeptical problem has always been with us since the ancients, since the very beginning. But the reason it wasn't noticed is because of glibness. And essentially, Aristotle disguised the problem by being glib. I mean, he didn't do that maliciously. I mean, he was sort of like too smart for his own mind. It's like too clever by half. All right? Okay, I wanted the camera to get it because I don't have time to read it all. Okay. By these trains of thought on form, soul, and perception, Aristotle felt he had dispensed with the Milesian, from Turkey, the Milesian occult substances, occult means hidden, the atomist invisible particles, and Plato's world of forms. No small feat, but he still does not say how he knows there is a cup. He only tells us what he believes he knows about it. This is an evasion that he succeeded at but was criticized for by Plato. Plato saw that he was evading a deeper question of the mind. All this was, like I just said, too glib by half, too clever by half. As I said before, in this painting by Raphael, these two people have forever represented the two approaches to the study of reality, the one pointing up in metaphysical sense, and the other pointing to the earth. I wish people to duly note that in both there is an external world, and we experience only a representation or phantasm. Phantasm was Aristotle's word for our memories of the thing in its of the things in it. Okay, so it wasn't a disagreement there. Like I said, there's never been a philosopher that didn't think we saw a representation of something somehow. They're not sure how. Okay. Next week, there is a spiritual story that begins before Plato. It begins with Pythagoras. It begins with Pythagoras, who was in Italy. He lived in southern Italy. Before about the time of not long after Thales. So a Milesian actually went to Italy, and philosophy got spread, and Pythagoras, for the Pythagorean theorem, you may have heard that he believed in reincarnation and was probably a saint or a perfect master, I don't know, maybe a saint of some sort.
Baba called him a fourth plane master.
Oh wow, far out, thank you. Baba called him a fourth plane master. So They couldn't eat beans, they were vegetarian, they lived in the woods. I mean, they were pretty far out people, the Pythagoreans, you can look them up. So there's a mystical story, starts with them, goes to Plato. Plato was influenced by several people, but especially him. And then you've seen the cave, and you've seen the beginnings of mysticism. Now, that cave analogy inspired Sufism. It inspired St. Augustine, who developed the philosophy of Christianity. It is and Baba refers to it. Oh my God, I forgot to tell you. Oh, remember the cave and those people tied up in the cave, the slaves? Okay. In Infinite Intelligence, Baba refers to that analogy in 2 sections. One of them, one is throughout, the other is an analogy he gives. It's based on the cave. One is Baba uses the word for a soul who's stuck in illusion as bandha. And bandha means slave. And it's like same root from the Sanskrit from where we get the word bondage. We're bound to the illusion, okay? And the other reference to the cave by Baba in Infinite Intelligence is there's a story of the philosopher and the bird cage, and he puts the bird who wants to know what freedom is, and he puts him in a cage, and then he takes him out of the cage and he frees him. But there's obvious references because the person who leaves the cave in Plato represents Plato himself. It represents the philosopher who has seen something. And when he comes to tell people, he seems like he's the stupid one, you know, that he suffered that. Then next week we will begin with the Renaissance and the beginning of modern concepts of perception. All this is necessary to understand the full nature of the problem that our answer that I believe Baba has given us solves. And it's something new. I'm not just repeating something that has been said. Unless we understand the problem and its culprit, we won't see what Baba solves. Which I think the future is going to be more than excited about when they see it. And I don't think they could be best. And that's the end. Thank you very much. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.